photogenic under special lights.
You're like uploading everything very fast.
Yeah, it's all lovely, thank you. Will you give us a 5-minute? I'm Cherry. If you give us 5 minutes?
Yes, at 5
You'll wait or something. Okay, I'll put my phone over here. Shall I, right, you and I can share this.
Yeah.
my mouth gets really dry.
So I think I will introduce you and then I'll ask each of you to say something and then we'll just kind of flow the conversation.
Okay.
Yes? And then we'll do some questions at the end.
I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah. You were here earlier.
You're the cardinal, really.
Lots of use of churches in this town. Okay. I know. Interesting that local news keeps coming up more and more during the day about like if there's not local news, what happens? Yeah. Yes. Hello. Hi. Welcome. My name is Rachael Jolley. I'm the editor of Index on Censorship magazine. Copy like this. We're a global magazine that covers freedom of expression issues around the world. We have contributing editors in different parts of the world, as well as publishing censored writing by novelists and journalists, and also art. We have a really interesting panel here today to cover this, I think, really important key subject for journalists at the moment. On my right is Kaya Genc. Kaya is a journalist based in Istanbul. He writes for the New York Times, the Paris Review, and he's contributing editor to Index on Censorship. He's also the author of 3 books, including Under the Rage and Revolution in Modern Turkey. On my immediate left, is Caroline Muscat. She's the co-founder of The Shift News in Malta, and it's an independent news organization. And some describe her as having taken over the role of the key investigative journalist in Malta after the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia. On my far left is Wana Udobang, who is a Nigerian journalist and radio presenter and poet, and she also works for the BBC and Al Jazeera. So I'm just going to ask each of them to introduce a little bit about freedom of expression and censorship in their country, and then we're going to get on to ways that journalists have kicked back against what's happening, and hopefully we're also going to hear some successes that we can take heart from. Kaya, can you kick off?
Thank you. So, Turkey is an interesting case, I think, because one of the founding principles of the Turkish Republic was censorship. The censorship of the country's past. It was a Islamic culture, and it had a different language. It had a different cultural tradition. And so there was a wholesale censorship to make the Republic possible. So there was a revolution of the alphabet in 1928, which banned some letters from the alphabet, including the W, Q, and X. And the reason for the ban of these 3 letters was to stop Kurdish people from giving their children Kurdish names. So the censorship began on the alphabet level, so to speak. So at the time, the National Geographic complained that the new alphabet made it very difficult for the keyboards, the Q keyboards, especially for the left side of it, because these 3 letters were gone. And this ban continued until 2013, when Erdogan, the Turkish then Prime Minister, lifted the ban. He also lifted the ban on Kurds giving Kurdish names to their children. But then, of course, those were his more democratic years. After this, of course, this is the Turkish Republic, but under the reign of the Ottoman Sultan, things weren't much better. The Sultan Abdülhamid, for example, was very angry about the depiction of his nose. He had a very pointed nose, and illustrations of that nose or poems about that nose led to censorship, and young Turks had to flee the country because of the censorship regime. And so this kind of censorship led to them going to Geneva, where they started publishing lots of new magazines, and then the eventual Young Turk Revolution. So Abdülhamid was a great modernizer, and he modernized the Turkish censorship as well, and he made it very effective. So in 1986, the Turkish state continued this tradition, the Abdülhamid's tradition of censorship, and said, we're going to burn the books that contain explicit scenes. And they decided that a novelist and a journalist called Ahmet Altan wrote an explicit novel, and so they wanted it burned. And so the publisher of that book complied, and he said, okay, I'm gonna produce a censored edition of Ahmet Altan's novel called The Knife in the Water. But as a preface, he put the prosecutor's indictment, which contained all the juicy and racy stuff, all the sex scenes, and he itemized them for clearer identification, and he also put the page numbers. So what the reader had to do was some mental copy and paste, so you could get the sex scenes quite easily. But to the public, he said, okay, the prosecutor is right, I'm giving you the censored edition. Another interesting example was in 2011, when a Turkish journalist called Ahmet Şık was writing a book on his computer, when out of nowhere the police entered his office, confiscated his computer, because apparently there was a Word document on his computer called 000book.doc, and they said, we can't let you have this document, we're going to delete it. And then they arrested him, and as he was put behind bars, it appeared that he was sharing this 000book.doc with some of his editor friends. And so the Turkish police confiscated the office of Radikal newspaper, and they tried to delete that particular file in that newspaper. But then it appeared that it was quite a difficult job. So it was a very dangerous thing to have that document in your inbox. So the Turkish publishers came together, and they published the book as 000book.com.doc. And they said, they didn't give their names, they said this is our responsibility, intellectual responsibility, to publish this book. And so the book was released. I think one general pattern in Turkish censorship is that in public, people have to say, okay, you're right, this has to be censored. But in their private lives, they keep on reading those books, use those letters. I interviewed a Kurdish lady for my new book, and she gave her name to me as a Turkish name, the name of a flower. And then when she got to know me better, when she trusted me, she told me her real name, which is Kurdish, and it contains one of those three banned letters. So I think it leads to a kind of gap between public and private selves in Turkey, and it leads to a kind of pathology, which maybe we may discuss afterwards.
Thank you very much. Wana, I wonder if you could maybe introduce a little bit of what's happening in Nigeria, the sort of debate between freedoms and censorship, and just in general terms, what you feel is going on currently.
Right. So with Nigeria, I think for a very long time, the world knew about, we had military regimes till about 1999, where we moved to a civilian government. One of the interesting things is that those decrees that were used then haven't particularly changed. So we did have a record of, human rights abuses of journalists being killed, many of them fleeing the country at the time. I think at the moment now, what's been happening there have still been interesting cases of journalists being arrested, or even news organizations being, harassed by the military or by the police as well, when writing stories that are not in agreement with, ruling parties. But one of the interesting things that's happening is, I think a lot of people are using the internet. I think Nigeria is ranked as like the 10th in terms of largest users of the internet at the moment, with about 103 million people having access to the internet through mobile technology. I think one of the most recent cases, I would say, of sort of countering censorship is there was a Arawa Me Too movement. So Arawa is a collective name for the women, for the people who live in northern Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim. And so it's sort of a group of young women who got people to start telling their stories on Twitter about both sexual and domestic abuses in their communities. In fact, one of the organizers actually got arrested, and it became a public outcry, and Amnesty International got involved, and then she got released as well. So I think the internet has been one of the really big ways to counter a lot of the censorship. One of the interesting things as well is the censorship hasn't only been sort of from big government agencies in that typical form that we know, but there's also like a sense of cultural censorship that happens with certain, even with journalism, where certain stories will never appear in the newspaper. See things about sexuality, say LGBTQ rights, and even, as we said, some issues around like abuse of women in northern Nigeria, and they typically probably wouldn't make front page as much. And so I think a lot of people have been using the internet to counter that sort of that form of cultural censorship as well. Something also new and interesting is the Digital Rights and Freedom Bill, which both civil society and journalists have been trying to push forward. And the idea is for this bill to allow, which is going to protect the rights of people who use online platforms, and of course mostly journalists as well, which the president has refused to sign.
Thank you. Caroline? I know there's so much you could say on this subject. Perhaps you can give us a little taste of what it's like being in, doing the job that you do in Malta right now.
I can't talk about censorship in the sense of burning of books or closing down of Facebook groups or Twitter accounts, this kind of thing. Malta was shocked into the modern reality of censorship by its worst form. The assassination of one of the most vocal critics of the government. Malta is a European Union member state. It shocked the nation and it shocked Europe. It was the first European Union, the first journalist killed in an EU country. So what do you do after that? We knew that we had a problem in our media landscape because more than 90% of the media in Malta is owned directly by the political parties. So you have a situation where most of the citizens in Malta get their news from TV, and there isn't one single independent TV station in the country. There's one owned by one of the major political parties, the other owned by the other one, and then the state broadcaster that is always under the control of government, despite the Broadcasting Authority Act that should guarantee impartiality in the Constitution. So both of these two main political parties, beyond the TV stations, have newspapers, dailies and Sundays. They have radio stations. They have online news portals. So this is mostly where citizens are getting their information. In between all that, you have a couple of independent newspapers who write in English. So they're not reaching the Maltese audience. So I was a news editor of Malta's leading independent newspaper, the oldest established, the Times of Malta and the Sunday Times of Malta. It was a bastion of democracy. In the 80s, it was literally burnt down. The mobs turned up and set fire to the building while everybody was still inside. But even the Times as an institution has now become very, very weak for a number of reasons. So, 16th October 2017, Daphne Caruana Galizia was leaving her home, and she was blown up in a car bomb. And I'm going to try and set the scene for you, because her home is set on the top of a hill. It's in the countryside, so as she was coming down, there was this massive, massive explosion. And it wasn't a single explosion, there were two. One was smaller, the first one was a smaller one, that literally blew her leg onto the field onto the opposite side of the road, and then the second one that actually killed her. It was a spectacle. It was intended to send a message to the entire country. Now, you don't mess with us. So what do you do at that point? What I did is join up with another two investigative journalists at the time, and I set up the Shift News, an online news portal dedicated to investigative journalism. We don't do the political party press releases, we don't do any of that. We do our own unique stories and we do our own investigations. What we've experienced has been now a year and 3 months that we've set it up, and what we've experienced in the last year has been quite phenomenal. First of all, keeping a news portal like that alive is a survival on a day-to-day basis. But what we faced in the first 3 weeks of operation, we were threatened with a SLAPP lawsuit. These are lawsuits that are filed in foreign jurisdictions, like the United States and the United Kingdom primarily, that are intended to financially cripple the journalists and the news organization. It was Henley and Partners, a global firm that works with the Maltese government to sell passports, European Union passports. It's obviously, there's huge money involved. So we got this threat in our first 3 weeks, and we received it on Christmas Eve, when nobody's paying attention to news. So we said, there's no way we can fight this, and the only way we can fight is to just push back and scream and publicize this as much as we can. So we called on the public to support us, and we stood up to them. And as we did this, it was something very interesting emerged. We learned that actually most of the other independent newspapers in the country had already received these kind of threats. And the threat is, remove your story or else. And these newspapers had actually removed all of these stories without informing the public that these stories were removed. It was one of our journalists, as we were doing research on this threat and how we're going to defend ourselves, we discovered this. And we still stood our ground. We fought them all the way on a very public level. And then, through our own example, at least one of the independent newspapers started to put back some of the stories online, because they saw this solidarity is so important. That was just the first one. We've been facing, we face libel suits on a regular basis. We've even had the Speaker of the House ordering us to remove a story, which is absolutely beyond his power or control, and we said no, and we won that as well. We've now facing another threat from just trying to support the investigations by OCCRP, we tried to extend that and bring it to the Maltese public, and we received the threat from the Russian banker as well. We stood our ground, and what we found is that the only way we've been able to fight this, I mean, they can shut down the Shift News tomorrow if they choose to, because there is absolutely no way that we can have the funds to ever fight this. But we've survived so far simply by pushing back, publicizing, and fighting, because we believe that if we leave nothing else behind, then one message that we can give out there is the need for global solidarity among journalists to fight this. When Daphne Caruana Galizia died, she was facing over 40 libel cases. Her bank accounts were frozen. That wasn't the first threat that she had received. Her house had been attacked twice, once set on fire where they were all sleeping inside. Her dogs were killed. She was set up as a target of hate. And one of the first things that we did was investigate how she was set up as a target of hate. But perhaps you can explain that later on.
Great. Well, as you can hear, that there is so much we could cover in this session. But what we're going to focus on is both how different tactics are being used against journalists, but also some of the strategies and tactics that journalists have used to push back. So, you know, as many of you know, there's so many ways that journalists are being attacked right now, both physically, mentally, reputationally, through being denied access to, say, government press conferences, to having their reputations attacked by bots online, by physical acts on the street, and ending, I guess, in the killing of journalists, which we for instance, we've just heard about. Wana, you mentioned the use of the internet, and I think that would be an interesting place for us to go, because the internet is being used at the same time for good and bad here. Yeah. And I mean, what do you feel at the moment about the sort of push-pull between those two things, how it's being used in some ways to undermine the reputation of journalists, for instance, but also how journalists have been using it to circumvent censorship or take their journalism into a different platform so it can still be seen, for instance?
I mean, I think it's a bit of a catch-22, because it's definitely democratized the way that, you know, people share the news or disseminate information as well. And as I did say, with you know, in terms of looking at censorship with traditional media, so in Nigeria, beyond the state-owned news corporations, you have private entities. So you have private radio stations and private television stations. Now, one of the interesting things with those is a lot of them are owned by elites. A lot of those elite people are connected with politicians and political parties as well. So that also affects the kind of news that, information that journalists are allowed to share when they work there. So basically the internet has kind of been this sort of last hope for any kind of independence in terms of you know, news and information and what people share with the public as well. But then at the same time, we also know that there are no gatekeepers. So you're constantly fighting disinformation and fake news and all of those sorts of things as well. So I think it is really a catch-22 in that regard. And I did say one of the things that they've been pushing for is this digital and freedom rights bill that's supposed to help to protect journalists, and especially when the government tries to sort of bully them using tactics like hate speech to get people arrested, because people have been arrested even from like things they've tweeted about or shared online as well. It's one of those situations where I don't know that I have a particular answer, but I think it's something that we must recognize, that there is a catch-22 within that. So it is a space that, you know, people can use as a source, as a medium to fight back, but then it is also something that can get out of hand if, you know, things are unchecked, so to speak.
It's coming at you from different directions.
Exactly.
I mean, Kaya, when I remember some examples of when Twitter was being closed down in Turkey. So, I mean, you have also a lot of examples of where Turkish people were using social media a lot to communicate and the government was so concerned about it that basically social media was down. I mean, have things, is that still going on? Have things changed at all as in terms of, you know, the value of social media?
They banned it in 2013 and 14 during certain times, and it was good for Twitter addicts because they could get off Twitter for a while. But more seriously, the pattern is this: the mainstream media doesn't report properly, and they serve the state, and so reporters take onto Twitter, and they build these massive followings on Twitter. They have 3 million, 4 million followers, which is very big numbers. And then these reporters become a force in themselves, and then the government locks them up. So it happened to Ahmet Çık, it happened to Erdem Gül, the Cumhuriyet newspaper journalist. And so suddenly their Twitter feed pauses because you then notice that they're in prison. And then when they're released, they get even more followers, and they get even more kind of respect from the audience because they're fighting for their stories. And now both of these two reporters have become politicians because that's the only immunity you have. So Ahmet Çık is a parliamentarian, and he's serving in the Turkish parliament. So no one can touch him, no one can touch his Twitter account. And Erdem Gül has now become the mayor of the Princess Islands in Istanbul. So it's kind of a reversal of roles. The journalists say if politicians are going after us, you know, we are going to be politicians ourselves. And so you see the opposition party, CHP, there are lots of journalists there. So journalists are becoming the politicians themselves because otherwise they're too vulnerable to state pressure.
And I mean, you and I were talking the other day about the Istanbul election results. Do you feel, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and whether that gives you a sense of any kind of optimism?
So it was a very close election for the Istanbul mayor, and the difference is smaller than a percentage of 0.1. So it's just a matter of 10,000 votes, and Istanbul is a huge city. So everyone tried to understand who really won, but the state agency showed that the AKP candidate was winning and the opposition candidate was losing, but then the difference was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then there was just 20,000 votes in between them, and then suddenly the state agency stopped reporting on the results, and it was like 11:15 p.m. and people were. It was like people thought they would get the results in those 30 minutes, but then the state agency said, you know, go back to sleep. In the morning, we'll give you a result. So people didn't agree with that order, so they went to Twitter. And so on Twitter, every kind of result was served by different reporters. So by 11 a.m. next morning, the state agency said, okay, the opposition won. We can do nothing about it. But so the state agency and the mainstream news organizations become kind of defenders of lies at time. So they are gaining this kind of bad reputation, and the reporters can't do anything about it because they're not deciding on these headings and these election results. So people only trust reporters on Twitter, and the election result is still contested. When I came here, the opposition seemed to be winning, but I don't know what will happen next week. And how can we verify the results? How can we fact check what has really happened? It's very difficult to do it because the media landscape is very monolithic in Turkey.
Caroline, could you tell us a little bit about digital attacks that you've experienced and whether you found any way to fight back against those?
One of the first things we did was look into where these attacks are coming from. As I said, we looked into how Daphne Caruana Galizia was set up as a target of hate. And we noticed on social media that there were certain patterns, you know, certain lines that were similar, narratives repeated and changed at the same time. So we were saying, where is this coming from? Who is coordinating this? And so we discovered 6 online secret and closed Facebook groups that belonged to the Labour Party in government. So we couldn't get in because you actually had to prove your membership with the party before you could actually gain access to these groups. But we did manage to gain access with the help of whistleblowers, and we monitored these groups for 6 months. What we found is that they had been built up over 7 years when the party was still in opposition. At the time, they were used, you know, to kind of garner support for the party and reach constituents easier. But as the party got into government, and particularly after the revelation in the Panama Papers, Malta had the only minister in the European Union exposed in the Panama Papers, and by the way, he's still in power and they're still in government. What we found is a very, very sophisticated and coordinated system that could whip up a cycle of hate within hours. It was horrific. What we also found is that when Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed, these groups were celebrating her death openly. Now, in these groups, you had the Prime Minister, you had the President, you had members of Parliament, you had all the, you know, aspiring candidates for the party. So, first thing we did was reveal all of this, and also the fact that they were being administered by government employees. The people administering these groups worked for the Justice Ministry, who is responsible, and which is responsible for protecting freedom of speech in the country. What do you do with that? The minute we exposed this, the first thing that happened is, first of all, they tried to ignore, and then we kept pressuring with the stories and revealing the disgusting memes and lies and misinformation that was being created in these groups. And then the Prime Minister was confronted in Parliament. He refused to leave the groups. And the third time he was confronted, reluctantly accepted to leave, but never admitted the groups functioned. Always said these were party groups, and this is about freedom of expression. That freedom of expression is defended, while the citizens' right to have their say is continuously undermined. So we have seen slowly that there's some kind of change happening in the groups. The fact that we exposed them and we didn't let go. This story has been over a year now. It was one of the first stories that we did. We didn't let go of this story. And slowly, we're starting to see that a toning down of these groups, because we have made it obvious that we are still there and we're still monitoring. So we're actually more cautious. Whether this leads to another wave of different groups being created to replace these, we will have to see. But the one thing that we have found is, first of all, expose, publicize, fight back. And the one thing we are trying to push as well is the need for solidarity among journalists, because the people who are attacking freedom of information are very united, whereas we, the ones trying to defend the facts, are very divided. So we need to find a way of uniting these forces and speaking with one voice and having one objective. And I think that these international collaborations that are being created to investigate the cross-border investigations that are going on money laundering and corruption is really the way forward in terms of defending our profession.
I want to ask something to you about the private and public distinction. So when you're a journalist who's been monitored by the state, you know that your phone is probably tapped and probably they are seeing what you're seeing on your screen. And does it lead you to a loss of the public and private distinction? Like when you are sending a private message to your friends, do you know that it's actually public?
It's always there at the back of your mind. And with the death of Daphne, what happened is that power to create hate and to discredit somebody's reputation is just shifting, is shifting from Daphne to other journalists and citizens. For example, there was one activist, Tina Urso, who organized a protest in London during a Henley and Partners event that the Prime Minister was attending. And within hours, her photo, her identity card, her family address, and calls for, you know, let's go and get her out of that home, literally a call for mob rule, was just whipped up within hours. Within hours, she was horrified. And they're also doing that to me now. For example, one meme appeared which you know, had Daphne's photo that said, "One witch has disappeared," and then my photo there, and another one has appeared. And a government employee beneath it goes, "Then this one deserves a few more bombs." Only a few days ago, my uncle was you know, he has these painting classes, and he was there at his session, and this is completely new. This man approached him and said, with photos, and said, "So this is your sister, who's my aunt, and this is your other sister, who is Caroline's mother," and just showing him that, you know, they know everything about us. And the first thing, obviously, I mean, the intention is that my uncle's going to call my mom's going to call me, and she's like, "Don't talk on the phone, don't talk on the phone." I said, "I've been telling you this for many years, Mom, we're there, you know, we are there." But what do? You have to move forward, you have to keep going, and we just try to be as transparent as possible, but yes, there is no distinction now between, you know, before it was easy for me to go to work, and when I clock off, I'm at home, and that's my private life. That does not exist anymore. I've had situations where, you know, I go shopping and I'm kicked out of the shop because I'm criticizing the Prime Minister, you know, her beloved Prime Minister, because you have this adoration, you know, the Prime Minister as king, as ruler. You get all these memes, so you get you get these parallel levels that censorship works, and it's leading. It is a very, very effective tactic because, for example, with the shift, I've trained at least 10 journalists over the last year, and the minute they start to publish, they run away because they're immediately surrounded and not allowed to breathe, you know, and they're young journalists, they're trying to, so it's very effective in that sense.
Let's take some questions. I have some more questions, but I think it'd be good to get some people involved. Does anybody, there's a mic? Does anyone have a question? There's a mic over there. No, thinking, lots of people thinking, very thoughtful faces, but don't have any questions. Yes, one here.
This is just one for Caroline. You mentioned earlier that the Times of Malta building was burnt down. This is some time ago, but can you just explain a little bit about the background to that, and if that has any connection with what's happening now?
Because we have two political parties in Malta, they have this they've built this system among themselves where they kind of understand that, you know, one's in power at one time and then it's the other one's turn. Mm-hmm. So we've had this system where one party's in power for 20 years and then the next one's in power for 20 years and it just keeps going like that. So when that happened, it was this Labour Party, well, the last time it was in government. Mm-hmm. The last 5 years of that government were very, very tough. Police beatings on the streets, you protest, you get arrested, people disappeared, you know, it's the same pattern, it just manifested itself differently then. was more open, and it was like direct order from the Prime Minister of the time, you know, saying these are the people who are working against you and this kind of thing, which led to it was after a mass meeting. So the crowd was already there, and, you know, he had just, you know, created that level, and they just headed straight to the Times building and tried to access it and then burnt it down. And it was a moment of extreme pride for the newspaper that that people went back and the newspaper was still published the next day. Now the pressures are different. Now the government, one of the ways the government does it is through a huge budget in terms of government advertising, and now the newspapers are entirely dependent on that. So for example, when we set up the shift, the first thing I did was call these newsrooms, because I've worked with all of them, and say, you know what, we're not here to compete with you. We're going to do the investigations, and we're going to give you the information, and let's publish together so we can spread the information as much as possible. That is our objective. And we did that with we had our first investigation into Malta's the sale of Malta's public hospitals, extremely corrupt deal. So we had that, we published it together, it was extremely successful. Immediately they got a call and said, you don't work with the shift anymore, you don't get our government advertising. So that stops. And so one of the first things they do is isolate you before they can silence you.
I think it would, we often in Perugia talk about idealistically the global solidarity of journalists. I think it'd be interesting to hear from all three of you whether you feel that that is a reality, or whether, in fact, the journalism community in all three of your countries has, you know, come together to fight back, or has been fragmented and ended up, you know, fighting within itself and being fractured. Kaya?
I think it's fractured because there's a dilemma. There's a moral dilemma. You want to be a journalist, but in order to be a journalist, in order to get a job as a journalist, some people become informers. They inform on their colleagues. You know, they point to their Twitter accounts and say, you know, look at what this journalist said about the president or this party. So, you know, it's very violent in Turkey because there are not many jobs, there are not many institutions. And we assume that most of the firing is being made by the president himself. But in fact, what I know from the newsrooms is that people are just trying to get their jobs in certain situations, which is a very depressing situation, of course. But then there is also great solidarity because after most of the respected journalists lost their jobs, they started these journalism initiatives, places like P24, and they became right defenders. And some of them started writing books about Turkish journalism and reports, documenting its failures. But in order to get a job in a newsroom, some people do the immoral thing.
Wana, the same question to you, really, in terms of, you know, the politics of journalism, I guess.
I mean, I think I wouldn't say, I don't think there's any solidarity in our case, because we also have this phenomenon which is called brown envelope journalism as well, right? Where so a lot of journalists are paid to publish certain stories. So sometimes, you know, the newspaper, some of the local newspapers and even the television stations are pretty much seen as propaganda for whether it's organizations or whether it's for the government as well. A lot of the time we also see how most journalists or editors eventually move on to working for government parastatals as communications officers and different things like that. So you have that division, and then you now have sort of local journalists who report for international media. But at the same time, as independent as that should seem, then there's also the assumption that it's very much Western driven in terms of the coverage or the storytelling. You do have pockets of independent news projects that have been springing up lately, which again are very much grant-based and grant-funded by a lot of countries in the West too. So you have You have a couple of those funded by the Open Society, projects funded by the Open Society, or organizations in the US as well. But yeah, I don't think there's any solidarity, so to speak. I think it's much more fragmented.
Caroline, do you get any support from other journalists in Malta?
Well, there are a few who support, of course, but it's a very difficult environment because of the division that there is. We have a press association that is again taken over by the two political parties, and then they appoint somebody as chair from the independent media to make it seem like it's actually functioning. The last time we had the DDoS attack on our site when we were publishing the hospital's investigation, there was absolutely no support. Nobody even reported the fact that we were under attack. And then the European Federation of Journalists filed a report with the Council of Europe. The government did not respond. And I reported that the complaint filed by the European Federation of Journalists, and excuse me, and in it I noted that their affiliate in Malta never said a word. And then 2 days later, there's a very reluctant, 2 paragraphs sent out. We support the stand taken by our international partners again in favor of the shift. I mean, do you have to put it that way? It's wrong, and next time it happens to you, we're going to be there to support you. So that's why I stressed in the very beginning that solidarity is so crucial.
I wanted to also mention that the chairman of the National Broadcast Commission is also appointed by the president. Just to let you, so even when you have newsrooms, say, for instance, when I worked at the radio station, you would always, once there's a debate or certain kind of conversation that isn't leaning in a certain direction, the radio station would get a letter from the NBC saying something or fining you for something or finding some reason to complain or to warn the station about, their news coverage or their presenters or things that were said the night before in a certain particular program. And they all come under these different sort of guises. But, at the end of the day, we really know what it's a way to kind of censor journalists. Yeah.
Anybody else want to ask a question or make a point? So let's take. Oh, sorry. You walk right away from him. Maybe we can take these 2 at the same time. So why don't you ask your question? We'll have the other question over here, and we'll take them both together.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question in particular for Mr. Genc, but also for the other speakers. State repression leads also to the creation of abroad communities of journalists who were forced to leave the country. So my question is, what kind of initiatives these abroad communities engage, and also on the other hand, what kind of threats they face? Thank you.
Okay, and then there was one here.
Hello, I'm a freelance journalist from Romania. I would also have a question about Turkey. So to Mr. Genc. Do you personally think something will change for the media and media freedom in Turkey now that CHP has a bit more power, or maybe as long as Erdogan is officially ruling the show, you believe that media will not have any further freedom or so as long as he's there? Thank you.
Kai?
So I'll begin with the second question. I think we had something similar in 2015. The opposition won big in the June elections. And then Erdogan said, I can't rule this country this way. There's too many complications in the system. So he made another election. And then he won much bigger. So some people are predicting a similar turn of events. And Erdogan is very skillful. So, and I don't see pro-government media becoming opposition media just because of the outcome. I think the results, maybe reporters working in the pro-government media were happy with the results because they were like, oh, finally some opposition, emerged. But I don't think that the optimistic atmosphere will continue because perhaps there will be a backlash. I'm not an optimist. As to the second question, these initiatives of journalists who are showing solidarity to their colleagues, the result is they become activists. So perhaps they no longer do their previous reporting on politics, on politicians, on city affairs, but they become activists who only write about cases of other journalists. So it really shapes their journalism and their output as writers. I mean, some of my friends who were working for mainstream pro-government newspapers who lost their jobs, they produce great nonfiction books. And I was joking with them, like, I'm so glad that you lost your job because now you're coming to our club and you're becoming a nonfiction writer. But then it's not a regular paying job, and then they cannot really perform as they used to. If you're a culture journalist, you cannot cover the culture scene if you don't have the job. And perhaps after a while, the activist life is not for everyone. You know, not everyone enters journalism to be activists. You know, they just have their beat and they want to report on it.
I have a follow-up question for that, actually. So it was interesting that you mentioned that some journalists in Turkey have gone on to become politicians. Do you sense that you know, they're trying to help, you know, change the way the countries run, I guess, not the government, the countries run? Is that going to be an effective way of changing the situation, do you feel?
Well, they know how to run newsrooms and how to run Photoshop, but maybe they don't know how to run metros and cities, so it's going to be a problem. But they also know how to run a campaign because against the imprisonment of journalists, because Turkey is the world's leader jailer of journalists. So the more journalists in the parliament, the more scrutiny of that fact we will see, because the government is just trying to sell the argument that they're just terrorists and they have nothing to do with journalism. So, but it's an interesting situation. I mean, you go to the parliament and you see all the journalists there. You know, they're not there to report; they're there to be quoted. So it's an interesting state of affairs, which we don't see, for example, in the U.S. You know, the Trump's rise didn't have that kind of outcome, because I think the separation of these different professions is much stronger in the U.S., but in Turkey it's more fluid. You can be a journalist one day, an activist the other, and then a politician on the third day.
And I think we have time for one last question. Yeah, right at the front.
Thank you. As we have understood from your stories, most of the times censorship is organized by the state. So the more the media are democratized, the more information are hidden. So how can we regain control on our fundamental freedoms?
Anyone have thoughts on that?
Well, it is quite ironic that the tools that were supposed to kind of revolutionize democracy ended up becoming tools of oppression. How I'm talking about the digital technologies that should have opened up our interaction, our communication, access to information and all this. In the beginning, governments tried, as we said before, try to shut them down, close off accounts and this kind of thing. But now they've realized they don't really need to do this, because Facebook has become one major tool in which they can create control. How to approach this? I think we need to look at the responsibility of these digital companies. I've said this before, I don't think that they can't continue to consider themselves as neutral carriers. They need to accept the responsibility of being publishers. like all of us do. As an editor, you have the duty to verify the information, to fact check, and you take responsibility for what you're publishing, and you face liability if you don't. In this case, they don't, and they are laws are created in a very, the bureaucracy surrounding policy making and all this. And even when laws try to catch up with this, technology has already moved forward. So it's a big challenge in that sense. And I think, like with any other form of empowerment, it's up to the people to make the demands, and it's up to the people to create the change.
I mean, I think I want to add that these days, journalism doesn't exist in a vacuum anymore, so compared to when you were just writing a paper and people read them and you didn't hear anything. But I would say that, I mean, in my experience and seeing how a lot of journalism information is being shared on the internet, and how there is direct pushback if something is wrong, or direct confrontation to that information and engagement with it as well. So I think that even the audience is now a very active participant in the news process and in that process of accountability as well. So, I mean, that's what I wanted to add to that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think that we've heard some examples today, but I hear them all the time, of the way that social media is being used to push back on stories in strategic ways by journalists and by organizations to put out responses to things. So I don't think it's only, as we were saying earlier, I don't think it's only one way. I mean, Wana was talking about how the internet is being used by journalists in Nigeria to put out independent news. Kaya's also spoken about how social media is being one of the places where Turkish journalists can get stories out that they can't publish in other ways. So I don't think we can't write off social media, and also, of course, new social media are coming up all the time. So there's room for development of new forms and new spaces. But even with the existing ones, there's both. They're being used in lots of different ways by lots of different people. So I think we're going to wrap up now. I would like to thank all of the panel for talking to us. I think you would agree that they all are doing amazing work. So can you please thank them, and thank you for coming. Okay. That's good. I love the alphabet stories.